Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell. Few phenomena in modern history have been as simultaneously repulsive and pervasive as anti-Semitism. To get some idea of how prevalent this stuff was, consider that in 1869, a revised version of an essay in German entitled Das Judentum in der Musik, that is to say, Jewishness in Music, was published by a guy named Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner was a German opera composer, which, even if opera is not your jam, Wagner's stuff. If you have ever seen a clip from an opera with the bombastic music and some sort of rotund lady in braids and a Viking helmet singing in an ear-splitting manner, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Wagner, like this. And Wagner was a bona fide superstar of his era, perhaps the most influential cultural figure in the entire Western world in the late 1800s. And in addition to his musical work, which, let us be clear, was absolutely life-changingly brilliant, on an artistic level, this guy was a bona fide genius. No doubt about it. But in addition to all of that stuff, he would write things like this essay, which was a vicious attack on Jews and their supposed toxic influence on European culture and their lack of genuine creativity, a whole host of creepy anti-Semitic stereotypes. So that somebody so influential could write this anti-Semitic screed. To get some sense of the impact that would have had, you'd have to imagine in the 21st century, a cultural influencer along the lines of, say, like a Kanye West or a Quentin Tarantino, that in addition to all of their other sort of artistic endeavors, instead of whatever blather that Kanye and Quentin are always on about, they would take time out of their careers to rant about how horrible the Jews were or something like that. So typically with these videos, the framing device I use is to ask the question, was such and such a thing BS? Talk about it a little bit, then answer it at the end. Given that there are moral dimensions to this particular question, right off the bat, without any ambiguity, I do want to be clear, if we're asking the question on the level, the specific content of anti-Semitic criticisms, that were the Jews somehow evil and out to harm anybody who was not Jewish, is that BS? Obviously! If you didn't know that already before watching this video, you might want to rethink your life and where you're getting your ideas from. But what we are asking is the question about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and its impact on world culture. Was that really such a big deal, or was the impact of modern anti-Semitism BS? That's what we're going to talk about. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is a very old phenomenon. It goes back centuries and centuries. But the old form of anti-Semitism, if we want to take, say, for example, medieval anti-Semitism, you saw, for example, pogroms, outbursts of violence against European Jews during certain times of tension, the Crusades, for example, the 14th century Black Death. You saw persistent accusations of blood libel, that supposedly Jews kidnapped and ritually murdered young Christian children to use their blood to make Passover matzah, or that they desecrated Holy Communion hosts, or that they somehow had horns and a tail that were invisible. I mean, like crazy shit like that was part and parcel of medieval anti-Semitism. But that stuff seems largely to have derived from religious difference, to the extent that people perceived a so-called Jewish question or a Jewish problem during the Middle Ages. It was purely a religious one, that the Jews rejected the divinity of Christ. It could be solved through the process of Jewish conversion. Mostly medieval anti-Semitism seems to have been driven by the fact that the Jews were the only non-Christian minority tolerated in Christian society, and therefore they were a convenient other to use as a scapegoat in times of tension. You know, it is an unfortunate aspect of our society's psychology that when we're scared, we look around for somebody to blame for it. We look for somebody who is a convenient not us to try and pin all our problems on. During the Middle Ages, the Jews were kind of like that. Now, all of that stuff in the modern era continued to play a role to a certain extent. I'm certainly not saying that religious anti-Semitism disappeared in the modern era, and all of that stuff, like people continue to riff off of the crazy blood libel stuff. But there were some new things going on. First and foremost, as a difference between modern anti-Semitism and medieval anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism often carried racial overtones. The late 1800s into the early 20th century were something of a golden age of racism. And you could certainly look at the writings of somebody like the French author Arthur de Gobineau, who was sort of the godfather of racist thought. You had thinkers like Heinrich von Treitschke or Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was Wagner's son-in-law, pick up on these racial themes and kind of apply them to the Jews and say that, well, you know, not only do we have some of the old bigotries against the Jews, but it's no longer even viewed as a religious thing, but rather these supposed negative qualities that anti-Semites associated with Jews, now they were posited as bona fide racial difference, that it wasn't a matter that could be solved by switching religions or something like that, but that it was supposedly a feature of blood and biology. So there was that whole new strain of thought in modern anti-Semitism. Likewise, too, there were a whole host of new anxieties as we got into the era of industrial capitalism, with all of its economic dislocations, with the rapidly changing social and cultural values. It was a very anxiety-ridden time for people. Just the sheer pace with which people's daily lives were being uprooted and transformed on a daily level. It was a tense time to be alive. And people in these times of tension, again, are looking for convenient scapegoats. So there is that kind of through line that was sort of true of medieval anti-Semitism. It remained true of modern anti-Semitism, that people were looking for somebody to blame for all of the stuff that they thought was wrong with modern capitalist society. But the example I want to focus on, to give you some sense of how dangerous this stuff has been, is to take a look at the German-speaking world. We've already talked about Wagner, but let me give you a couple of politicians, specifically in the city of Vienna, focused on the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, sort of at the turn of the 20th century. The first of these politicians is a guy named Karl Lueger, who is the head of an organization called the Christian Social Party. He was a very smooth, very sort of polished political figure, had enormous success in appealing to the lower middle class in Viennese society during this era. And one of the things that he used in his successful political career, which culminated in him being elected mayor of the city of Vienna, was anti-Semitic rhetoric. And it was obvious to a lot of people that Lueger's anti-Semitism wasn't even particularly sincere. He was called on it from time to time. That some of his buddies that he played cards with, for example, were of Jewish background. And yet he was using this nasty anti-Semitic rhetoric. And his response to this was, Wer ein Jude ist, bestimme ich. I decide who is a Jew. Revealing that he was using this rhetoric for very cynical purposes. He didn't even personally believe it. And this does not obviously let him off the hook. In some ways, I think it's worse. That he is playing upon the hatreds of the voting population for the purposes of his own political career. And that gives you a sense, I think, that anti-Semitism on a political level was used as a populist appeal to try and get the voters out and give them somebody to blame. Lueger is one Viennese politician using anti-Semitism for cynical purposes, but very successful. There was another guy at the same time who sort of has the opposite kind of career arc, a guy named Georg von Schörner, who is the head of the Pan-Germanist Party in Austria-Hungary, which was a virulently German nationalist party that sought to advance the interests of the German nationality within this big, diverse, multinational empire. And certainly, whatever you'd want to say about Schörner, he was a sincere anti-Semite. In the sense that this was the flip side of his German nationalism, and he personally, it was obvious to everybody, he believed this. He hated Jews and argued that they were behind a whole host of things that he thought were wrong with his society. So a hardcore anti-Semite, but someone who was never a successful politician in Viennese society. He was something of a failure because he was too radical. He turned off a lot of respectable Austrian voters. I bring these guys up not because you should particularly know or care about Karl Lueger and Georg von Schörner, but simply to note that among other people who were around in Vienna during the late 1800s and into the first decade of the 20th century, was in particular a struggling artist and crank conspiracy theorist, a guy you have heard of, a dude named Adolf Hitler, who at the time, German nationalist, anti-Semite, somebody who, like, if the internet had been around back then, he totally would have been on Reddit and browsing like 4chan and 8chan and would have been into like QAnon and all of the creepy conspiracy theory bullshit and stuff like that. He was watching these anti-Semitic politicians and kind of taking mental notes and looking at them and saying, for example, well, Schörner, I agree with his anti-Semitism. Like, he's good on the ideas, but clearly he's something of a failure as a politician. Lueger, he's insincere. He doesn't really believe this stuff as much as he should, but he is somebody who is really appealing to Viennese voters. So Hitler was already, as a young man, seeing how he could combine the kind of ideological solidity of Schörner with the smooth-talking success of Lueger. And obviously, that's why this has an impact. That Hitler clearly is a guy who eventually, some 20 years later, went on to become a leader of the German Empire, start the most destructive war in all of world history, and ultimately murder some 6 million plus European Jews. So that's why this stuff matters, is because it has catastrophic consequences. And obviously consequences that have not diminished even in the 21st century. Much as we would love to be able to say that anti-Semitism is no longer a problem in the modern world, clearly it is. As an overview of modern anti-Semitism from 1700 to the early 20th century, Jacob Katz's From Prejudice to Destruction, published in 1980, is a solid overview of anti-Semitism throughout the Western world. If you're specifically interested in anti-Semitism in the German-speaking lands, Peter Pulzer's The Rise of Political Anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria from 1964 is a great sort of detailed overview of that political movement and how it gathered steam. Obviously, one of the issues that a lot of scholars have been specifically interested in dealing with is the relationship with all of this anti-Semitic rhetoric and eventually the rise of Nazism in Germany, World War II, and the Holocaust. For that, an excellent scholarly work is George Mosse's The Crisis of German Ideology from 1964, which deals with some of the background, anti-Semitic and otherwise, of the Nazi movement that was sort of zinging around the German-speaking lands in the late 19th century. And finally, I mean, one of the disputes among scholars of anti-Semitism is, how distinctive is the modern variety of anti-Semitism? How much does it have in common with the more ancient varieties? If you're interested in a more comprehensive overview of this, the place to go would be Marvin, Perry, and Frederick Schweitzer's Antisemitism, Myth and Hate, From Antiquity to the Present, from 2003. So there's plenty of stuff to read out there. If we're looking for a verdict to the question of whether modern anti-Semitism was really that big a deal, or whether it was just BS, the answer is obviously not BS at all. Absolutely one of the more dangerous sets of ideas that has played a critical role in the history of the modern world and has led to the deaths of millions. So an important phenomenon, one that is well worth understanding to better fight against it. Thanks. Bye.